We have all heard about spouses killing one another for insurance money, of black widows killing their husbands out of resentment, of deranged parents ending their own children's lives. But perhaps there's no woman as prolific at doing all this than Mary Ann Cotton, one of, if not, England's first serial killer. A woman who killed around 21 people, all for greed and enjoyment. This is the arsenic killer, Mary Ann Cotton. Our grimmest tale begins in a fitting setting, Victoria-era England, and starts in a small town in northeast England, the town of Low Moorsley. A child would be born on none other than October 31st, 1832. That child would be the monster in this story, Mary Ann. Soon after Mary's birth, her and her entire family would move to a slightly bigger town called Merton, where tragedy would strike. Her family was a working class family, and her father a miner. And one day at work, he would fall to his death down a mine shaft. The body destroyed from the fall would be delivered to Mary's mother in a sack with the words, and I quote, "Property of the South Heaton Coal Company," printed on it. And because the house was owned by the company and her father now lay dead, the company man, her mother, Mary, and the rest of her siblings would be evicted. Mary's mother would remarry. In this era, you pretty much had to, especially if you had children and are a working class family. As for Mary Ann and the rest of her siblings, well, they would have to grow up fast. Mary would go to school for a while, and by all remarks, be an excellent student. She would then go into the profession of becoming a dressmaker. Then, at the age of 20, in 1852, she would marry a William Mowbray. Poor fool, had no idea what he was signing up for. Together, Mary Ann and William would move to southwest England and have a lot of children. And I do mean a lot. By 1856, they'd be at their fifth child, and unfortunately, in 1856, 4 of those 5 children would die from gastric fever. Gastric fever, which modern name goes by typhoid fever, is not a good way to go. But they did the very English thing and pressed on, having even more children. The exact amount is hard to verify due to the lack of records back then, but an estimate is Mary Ann and William would have 8 to 9 children together. William, having already felt the pain of losing 4 children, wanted to cross his I's and dot his T's and get life insurance on himself and the rest of the family, including the children. Little did he know that this, the act of trying to ensure your family is taken care of after death, would be his death warrant. In 1860, another child of theirs would die, and once again, another child in 1864. Then, in 1865, William himself would perish. All 3 of them would die the same way the first 4 children died. Gastric fever. Now you may be thinking to yourself, Mike, though awful, and people die all the time, and disease spread commonly? And you'd be right. And that's what the family thought, what all the townspeople thought, what the authorities thought. But gastric fever, this was not. For, you see, gastric fever has similar symptoms to arsenic poisoning, except arsenic poisoning kills you much faster than the fever. So as I continue this story with gastric fever, I'm really saying arsenic. From Mary Ann's marriage with William, only 2 children would survive, one of them being the second, Margaret Jane. The first Margaret Jane died, so the parents just decided to reuse the name, hence second Margaret Jane. After William died, Mary would go to the insurance company and collect the payment of her husband and children's lives. She got about 35 British pounds, which at the time is about half a year's wage for a working class family. With her husband dead, she would move to Seaham Harbor, and during this time, Margaret Jane would die from gastric fever. And the last surviving child, Isabel, would be sent to live with Mary Ann's mother. While at Seaham, she would go into a relationship with a Joseph Natterez. Keep that name in mind. Joseph would be saved from her poisonous arsenic grasps for the moment, when a new opportunity would arise for Mary. A job at Sunderland Infirmary House of Recovery for the Cure of Contagious Fever, Dispensary, and Human Society. Jesus, that is a mouthful. But the new job at the infirmary meant new opportunities in more ways than one, and for the time, left Joseph be. While working at the infirmary, one of her patients would be an engineer, a George Ward. George quickly fell into the spider's web and fell in love with Mary. The two would marry in August 1865, and a little over a year, in October 1866, George would die due to, you know it, gastric fever. Though the death certificate said he had both gastric fever and cholera, so little column A, little column B. Everyone who was close to George was surprised how quickly the disease took his life, and how quickly Mary went and collected the insurance money. With another victim, she would find a new occupation, this time as a housekeeper to a distraught widower who had just lost his wife, a James Robinson, who was a shipbuilder with children of his own already. With Mary being the new housekeeper, one of James' sons would die from gastric fever. This woman was poisoning everyone with arsenic, men, women, children. It made no difference to her as long as it made sense to her. In his grief, James would turn to Mary and get her pregnant. Wanting to do the right thing, James and Mary would get engaged. When news of her mother would reach Mary, her mother, who was still looking after Isabel, her child from the first marriage, had become sick from hepatitis and asked Mary to see and help her. Mary obliged. As Mary arrived, her mother was beginning to improve in health and show signs of getting better, when Mary Ann decided to take over the care. That's when Mary Ann's mother started to get stomach pains, symptoms like gastric fever, and die only 9 days after Mary showed up. Now, with Mary's mom out of the picture, Mary turned her attention to her daughter, Isabel, who she would bring with her to her fiancé's home. James and Mary Ann would marry in August 1867, where afterwards Isabel and two of James' children from his previous marriage would become mysteriously sick, get stomach pains, and die. All three would die, and Mary would collect the life insurance on her daughter. Isabel died in February 1868. But wouldn't be long till Mary Ann and James would have a second child, which would be born 1869. That's when Mary started to press her luck. You see, Mary had been killing so many people and collecting the insurance money, she started to get sloppy and push too hard. And after the birth of the second child she had with James, she was trying to convince him hard to get life insurance. From what I can tell, because she was so adamant about him getting life insurance, James started to ponder, investigate why. After some time, he discovered she had not the best relationship with money. While married to James, Mary Ann had run up debts of 60 British pounds, nearly a year's salary, had stolen 50 pounds from him, and had been making the children who were old enough pawn household items to get more money. What she was spending the money on, I do not know. As soon as James found out, he tossed her ass to the street and kept the children. Thank God he kept the children. It would now be 1870. Homeless, poor, no prospects to woo or poison. It seemed that Mary's killing streak would end. That would be until Mary Ann would run into her old friend, a Margaret Cotton, who, wouldn't you know, just happened to have a brother who was now a widower. You can see where this is going. Margaret's brother, whose name is Frederick Cotton, would be introduced to Mary Ann. And when you know it, in this time frame of Frederick meeting Mary Ann and getting to know her, Frederick would lose his sister and his youngest child. Though there's no evidence that Mary killed those two. But if I was a betting man, I know where I'd place my bet if she did it or not. Later in the same year, Mary Ann and Frederick would marry, but yet Mary would still legally be married to James. Again, Victoria-era England, paperwork is kind of iffy. Together, Frederick and Mary would have a son. And in 1871, when you know it, Frederick and two of his children would die from, that's right, gastric fever. At this point, even if you don't suspect her of poisoning anyone, you would think someone would think she was a carrier of the disease, or cursed, or something. But no. Oh, and since Frederick was dead, guess who got more insurance money? That's right. The widow, Mary Ann Cotton. Back to being a widower again. Where she would strike back up with one of her older loves, Joseph. Told you remember that name. Well, they would be having a romantic relationship, and while doing so, she would find another victim, a John Quick Manning, whose real name was most likely Richard Quick Mann, and name just got changed over the years and misspelled as time was on. Well, Mary and Quick hit it off, and Mary would become pregnant with Quick's child, which this pissed off Joseph for obvious reasons. And when you know it, somewhere in their relationship, Joseph added Mary to the will. And when he became angry that she cheated on him, he somehow died before he had the ability to change the will. And guess what he died from? That's right, gastric fever. And now pregnant again, she was trying to marry the father of the child, Quick. At first, there was hesitation. The excuse being, she was taking care of her stepson, Charles Cotton, from the previous marriage. This, in fact, would be her downfall. One day, when a parish official, a Thomas Riley, asked Mary to help him with a sick woman, they would be talking, and she would complain to the official about Charles, and tell Thomas, and I quote, "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest of the Cottons." End quote. This raised red flags to Thomas. Soon, like a few days after that comment Charles Cotton would die from gastric fever. God, this episode could have been turned into a drinking game. Well, the red flags were at full mass in Thomas's brain, and he decided, something isn't right here, and went to the police. The police decided to investigate and do an autopsy on the boy, where in his stomach they would find arsenic. From there, the police decided to dig a little deeper and exhume the bodies of two of Cotton's siblings and Joseph, where they would find more arsenic in the stomachs of the dead. The police would then arrest Mary and charge her on the counts of murder. The trial would be heavily delayed, for Mary was pregnant once again with another child from Quick. Eventually, while imprisoned, she would give birth to her daughter in January 1873, a Margaret Edith Quick Manning Cotton, who would be the only child to survive Mary Ann Cotton's arsenic poisoning killings. Now, not pregnant anymore, the trial for the murder could begin. Mary denied all the charges and pled not guilty, saying the arsenic came from somewhere else, like the walls, which holds some merit. At this time in this world, everything has some arsenic in it. Paint, baby carriages, toys, list goes on and on. And that was the main defense used by her lawyer, a Thomas Campbell Foster, that these children and man did die from arsenic, but from arsenic in the colored dye used in the green wallpaper of the home. Step in the scientist, who basically closed the case for the prosecution. They testified that they can tell the difference between arsenics. The arsenics used and found in the dead bodies were different from the arsenics used in the paint. The arsenic in the bodies and used for all the killings was liquid arsenic, not fumes, not paint, not residue and poisoning from skin exposure, but liquid. It was enough for the court to hear and find Mary Ann Cotton guilty on the count of murder and sentence her to hang. On March 24th, 1873, Mary Ann would be hanged, but, and I quote, by a notoriously clumsy hangman. This hangman messed up. He didn't put Mary's gallows high enough for the hanging. So when the trapdoor opened, Mary Ann fell with the noose around her neck, but the height wasn't high enough to break her neck. So then the executioner, who failed at his job, had to press down on her shoulders for 3 minutes, apparently, before she did actually finally die. Karma, I guess, catches up with you in one way or another. Mary was 40 when she died. Many credit Mary Ann Cotton for being England's first female serial killer. Yes, there had been other women poisoning people, angry wives, spiteful women, but never to this level. A level where she murdered upwards of 21 people. Many of them children. Some even her own. Which, it is hard to imagine that kind of evil. So next time you drink some tea your partner gave you, or eat some soup your spouse made, make sure you watch them drink it too. Especially if you told them you have life insurance. For who knows? A black widow could be in your own home. And arsenic could be in your glass right in front of you. And that is the story of Mary Ann Cotton, an arsenic serial killer who killed men, women, and children and became England's first woman serial killer. Thank you all for listening.